Hello, I'm Eugene.
And I'm Chris.
And we are the facilitators of a project called Courage to Look. And today we have with us, all the way from Canada, Leslie, for a conversation entitled Deepening the Conversation, of all things. So welcome, Leslie, and thank you for joining us. When we had our May 1st, I believe, group meeting, you said something that really struck me, which was, why don't we talk about this? We're reading this material from Professor Takaki, and we're trying to unveil the systemic racism that it's very difficult for all of us, no matter what our culture is. So why don't we talk about it?
It's interesting that that has come up really recently in another context. I was just doing some reading on a historical document on the history of, get this, taxes in Canada and its connection to slavery. And so Canada tells a story about itself that we didn't have slavery, or we ended it so much sooner than you guys, and so much better. But there's a historian who talks about, yeah, well, while it's true, slavery ended here earlier, my part of Canada, the East Coast, was heavily dependent on the economy of slavery because it was part of the Atlantic trade, right? And so the income that rich families in, say, Nova Scotia depended on was slave-produced goods. And she said, what I love about this is she's this tax historian, and she goes, so there's an economic basis here. She goes, more importantly, the reason, it's not like people didn't talk about slavery worldwide as a problem at this time. We tend to say, oh, it was common and people didn't know better. They damn well did. But they didn't talk about it in Nova Scotia because to open that can of worms, to be open an uncomfortable reality about their own wealth and an economic truth about, ooh, if we talk about this, we're looking at our own income and our own comfort. And so it wasn't like there weren't criticisms of racism going on. It's just their economic interests meant they didn't want to talk about it. And there was a silencing of this. And it made me think, that's the same going on today, right? That why we don't talk about this is not an innocent process. It's a very motivated process. Talking about it means then you'll know, and then you're going to have to open up that uncomfortable reality, which none of us, especially people who have benefited from it, people who have benefited from it, want to keep very quiet, because it's better that people just think that's the way things are and there's nothing to be done. It's my theory.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, there's a saying, you can't motivate someone to do something that they're paid to do. Yeah, and to this point, I mean, white people have, in various ways, definitely economic benefited from, the legacy of slavery and other forms of discrimination and mistreatment of people of color, and just in general, people dealing with something that they did wrong. That's something we're just not conditioned to do, much less something as hurtful, to put it mild, of some of the developments of our governments. I get the sense people's relations to one another, white people to people of color, stalling. But I think when it gets to the notion of economics and like more systemic things, I think that's when people turn on, because like you said, they have to acknowledge, yeah, I got some benefit here, and it's really makes me uncomfortable.
And I'm finding myself that going through Takaki's book again, this isn't a commercial, but going through this material again, which has been incredibly difficult, because as we were talking recently with another participant, now we have to hold ourselves accountable to a group to discuss at least whatever popped up for us. It's kind of, for me, it's sort of like working with this material emotionally and spiritually, and let alone practically. How am I going to change my life, in my own circles? It's kind of like a bad relationship. It's like wherever I look, there's the toothpaste is left undone, or the toilet paper isn't put, strung in the way I like it to be, and the dishes are left strewn. And every time I turn a page in this book, it just reminds me of that feeling, that felt like, yeah, another one. There's another one. There's another, there's another toothpaste cap. So there, it's like, so that was my thing this morning, because I actually took a moment to get a grip and say, I don't need to be so focused on this material, because it's really, really vivid. And so I grabbed, I just got the audiobook version, because I don't want to read it again.
Well, I mean, this is really serious stuff. I mean, we're talking about, the worst part of humanity here for, a couple hundred pages. It's not like reading, a nice, nice page turner, nice romance story or something. But, that kind of begs the question, we're all as a group taking in this material, and, how deep do we allow it to sink in? I guess I'm someone who I like to take things in dosages. So just taking it a little bit at a time, maybe falling a little bit behind the reading, but yeah, it's a fine line between taking it in and overwhelming yourself and becoming, wounded in a way.
I'd like going back to the Resma Menachem. Was it a video? Did we read that? Can't remember. And I think I also, right? And then I read some of his other stuff, but he talks about, it might have been in the Wisdom 2.0 thing. He was talking about, you're tempering the vessel. Like, you got to take a little bit at a time, a little bit. You're building up your strength to deal with 400 years of horror. So there's a kind of tempering process that goes on that, you're, because otherwise, yes, overwhelm just makes you lie down and weep, right? So nothing happens. And but not doing it at all means nothing happens either. So you got to do this kind of, just a little bit of poison, right? Just get used to it, get used to the pain. Okay, come back. Which I got to say, the course has been set up really nicely to be able to do that. Just, okay, I can take it. Now I need a break.
We were having a chat just before we started recording, and there's, in my circles, you mentioned a phrase that just jolted me a little bit. In my various circles among white people, whenever anything arises, whether it's unconscious bias or implicit advantage or any of the above, any of the above, the phrase, that's not my history, that had nothing to do with me, I wasn't responsible personally for that, why should I talk about this? And I usually just turn around and walk away, because it's frustrating.
Yeah, I encounter that a lot. I mean, we all do it. And I certainly see it among my students when we discuss this kind of thing, but that happened a long time ago, right? That's past. And we even have a premier of this province who, in dealing with Indigenous people very recently, said, well, I'm not interested in the past. Okay, so what? You just arrived fully formed from the head of Zeus on this planet with no links to the past? And what happened, you guys may not have heard, but in Canada, we're going through a real historical reckoning in the last, I guess it's been a week now, where we've told Indigenous people, well, that's in the past, right? You really need to get over it. And we've known, and there's been inquiries into the history of residential schools in Canada, right? And the horrible physical and sexual abuse and cultural abuse of Indigenous people that went on. And it was state sanctioned, it was state engendered from our first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, through till the 1990s. The last one was closed down. And Indigenous people, there was a big inquiry a few years ago, and Indigenous people have been saying, people went to these schools and never came home. And it kind of was part of the narrative until a week ago, they found the bodies of 215 children at one residential school in Canada. So there was this kind of moment, well, so we're in this moment of shock and horror and reckoning for what was a genocide, but very few people will call it a genocide in Canada. And the Indigenous leaders pointing out, see, the past is not over, right? We're still finding the bodies. And now we're starting to look for the other bodies. We know they exist, right? From hundreds of years of colonialism, but this is even more, this is from 1867 to 1990. These children were killed or allowed to die. And the past is very present, right? So that idea that's got nothing to do with me, that's something separate. No, it's actually right here, and as well as, of course, the history is everything. You didn't get here fully formed from the head of Zeus, right? Stuff coming down.
You know, kind of to our conversation before about, you know, why white people in particular don't like talking about race. Yeah, it's some kind of cultural tick that, at least here in America, people like to think they're self-made or they pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and you know, that it doesn't, at least for me, it doesn't take much thinking to think that that's not wholly the case. But yeah, that is kind of an interesting thing. And yeah, I'm sorry for the Indigenous people, you know, in Canada and also here in America to have experienced this type of, you know, trauma, and, you know, over many generations.
Mm-hmm.
I was just going to follow up. So you mentioned Canada's going through a reckoning. A week is probably too early to really tell, but is there a sense of a path out of this, or what's been some of the talk about this?
I think we're still in the usual white person shock, right? At this point, it's like, oh my God, it was true. So I think we're still there, and how we come out of this is still being articulated. Certainly, there's lots of suggestions that, you know, an apology is not enough, right? There have been a number of apologies to Indigenous people, and some better than others. There's certainly an ask right now to the Pope, because this was a Catholic residential school, but they weren't all Catholic schools. But certainly the Catholic Church has been held accountable. And there's been an apology movement. But then there's also well, come on, Indigenous people still make up, is it 1 in 4 Indigenous people are living in poverty? You know, they're way out of proportion to their population level. They make up a large percentage of people in poverty in Canada. They're still suffering from various effects. Without some material restitution, apologies mean nothing. And this is pretty clear. One of the really painful things that's going on is the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal did rule a few years ago, not in relation to the residential schools, but just to, even in most recent times, in the last few decades, that the infinitesimal amount of money that the Canadian government has spent on Aboriginal children's social welfare and education has resulted in them being removed from their families at a much higher level. And they've been chronically underfunded in comparison to non-Aboriginal Canadians. And so that the government owes them a specific amount of restitutional money. And the government has fought in court, tooth and nail, against this ruling by the Human Rights Tribunal. And so that has been one of the first things that Aboriginal leaders have said. So you found these bodies and the horrors of what you've done to Indigenous people over the years, and the children in particular. We've got a more recent case which has said, and even recently, you are chronically underfunding them and leading to all sorts of problems. And you're fighting it in court. I think the first step might be to drop the court case, right? I mean, pretty basic kind of pay. And that's just the beginning, the tips of it, right? But there has been a Royal Commission, which has, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which has come forward with, I think it's 98 recommendations of what needs to happen in Canada, some of which have been acted on, but there's a whole raft of recommendations about what needs to be changed and how. And so there's, again, a real push on, okay, how about, you've done 2, what about the other 96?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I really was surprised at the amount of commentary on Pope Francis's stopping short of the apology and then making it about that. So what is it about? Because I don't know that. So you mentioned restitution. Is there, how long will this take to address these issues that have been these set of steps and so forth, and what can the United States learn from that?
Mm. That's a good question. I mean, some of it will take lifetimes, of course. It took hundreds of years to do in the first place. But some of that, like, I read through the recommendations once. I'm going to do it again because actually a lot of the recommendations are so obvious. Like, they're not radical. They're just pretty obvious steps of what you got to do between apologize. And psychologists talk about the 7 steps of apology, right? And you know, you got to mean it. Gotta not do it again, promise not to do it again, find ways to ensure institutionally that you're held accountable and made sure not to do it again, make it material so that you show some token of your true apology. And the 98, I think it's 98, but the numerous recommendations in the TRC, some of them are just really straightforward. And it's sort of things like, look and make sure that every medical school, every law school, especially police training college, has required courses in Indigenous history. Right? How hard is that to do? Not very hard. It's pretty easy, actually. And this is one of their, people have to know, people have to learn, and it's not enough to just stick it in there as a kind of, oh, well, you could. It's not, no. Why wouldn't you make it a required part of a medical degree, a required part of a policing degree, a required part of a law degree? You know, and in fact, it's also becoming, and universities are working on it. You know, it's becoming part of a required. If you're going to get a university degree, you will have had a course in Indigenous history or Indigenous settler history. Right? These are not hard things to do, but there is certainly a resistance to doing them.
You know, as you know, is in America when, you know, the notion of reparations towards African American for the government's role in slavery, there is thankfully a congressional commission which is going to take place at some point, which is you know, a quantum leap from where things were before. You know, even though the notion of reparations isn't new, like the kind of, you know, fringe level mainstream support of it is, even though it's you know, the numbers are against it at the moment. The question maybe needs to be asked, you know, I assume people are tired of hearing about these issues, but you know, what is it about, you know, our respective cultures that makes taking action so difficult? Because there's, you know, I'm sure people are, even people who, you know, they don't necessarily think of themselves as progressives or anti-racist. They may feel some sense of emotion about the notion of what happened to the Indigenous people in Canada, or, you know, African Americans or Indigenous people here, but there's some kind of disconnect between taking action that is the real problem.
Yeah, the taking action is, I think it's so vital, because if all we have to do is connect the dots to where certain things in history sort of went wrong, and how it's compounded to this very day. And I don't know, I haven't read the Congressional Commission recommendations, and I'd love to read the commission from Canada's. Maybe we could put that link in the comment section here, or the description section here of this video. But if it just seems to me that if you connect the dots, we don't have enough money to pay. We're going to go broke if we paid for I mean, it's just horrible what I've where I am in my reading and in this book is this country will go broke, and maybe that's what it takes. But that touches on the notion of white fragility, which was where I was going with the previous question. Um, and it's why I find it so difficult to engage conversations with most of my white friends because of the reactionaryism. So I think, and I could be totally wrong, and maybe the next generation will be a different generation, but for a white person to call another white person out on the implicit bias, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is more effective than for a person of color to to do the same thing, because then there's all sorts of false imposed things and exaggerated guilt expressed as a way of of maybe turning off the conversation or whatever. But yeah, maybe you could speak to that, uh, um, Leslie, and because I think there where we get to see some of the keys that unlock how to deepen this conversation and actually make it fruitful.
Mm. Yeah, well, two things, right? I think the white fragility piece is absolutely central to understanding how this system works. But I always do a footnote when we think about, oh my God, it would cost so much money. And if you truly paid for, if you actually actually accounted for, yes, right, the whole system would collapse. But restitution never really, it's a gift, right? It's a kind of tokenistic, more than tokenist, but it is a kind of, there's a thing in psychology about handing over something that's meaningful to you as a material embodiment of your true sense of, I really am sorry. So I can't fix it. I can't undo what has happened, but to hand over something meaningful has a certain effect. And what always amazes me is, like, if we think about it in the economy right now, we are rolling in dough. It's mind-boggling how much money there is in the global economy right now. Right? When we think, like here, I think people get nervous about if I admit that this is part of my inheritance, that my family had a lot of money because of this. Oh my God, I'm going to lose something. But the fact is, there's so much money. The economy grew. I think it's the prediction for 2021, COVID, 5.6% globally. It's enormous. The billionaires in the world got 27% richer last year. Like, it's mind-boggling. Apparently, the 100 Billionaires Club has just added 2 more people. They're all white guys, the top 10. No surprise there. Bezos, and you could name them all. You'd recognize them all. Musk. The 2 guys who founded Google, I think, just get added. They're worth over $100 billion. The share of the global economy controlled by this 1% has increased over the last 10 years, when we've been going on about, oh my God, the 2008 recession, oh my God, COVID, we're going down the tubes. Money has been made, and crap loads of it. It's just all stuck at a certain spot. And if we actually used governments to do what they're supposed to do and tax the rich, and the G7 met this past weekend and said, oh, we're going to tax them 15%. I think the US actually said 21%, but the Europeans pulled it back to 15%. And everyone's going, that's nothing. Like, what most of the world was asking for was 25% on, Google and Facebook and Amazon. Like, come on. They are making billions of dollars during a global recession. And when you look at the eye-popping amounts of money being made through racist exploitation of the working people right now during a global economy, like a global meltdown in the economy, it's not a problem. There's actually all sorts of money. Like, it is just mind-boggling. How does this work? There's it's like a handful of people in the world, the 1%, who make more than 95% of the global population put together. It's just mind-blowing. So there is, and this is what I loved about Takaki, is how he does bring together those two forces, right? It's both psychological and ideological, you know, the beliefs around race, but that feeds a global capitalism and a global material rapaciousness of resources that has created a juggernaut of wealth. Like, it's just mind-bending. It's just all kind of, it's stuck at the top, and stuck at the top more and more and more. Like, I think it was like, I wrote it down somewhere, but it was in 2010, maybe, there were 388 people in the world who made as much money as 50% of the planet. That's 2010. By 2017, that number had dropped to 80 people made as much as 50% of the planet. It's not getting better, it's getting worse. So it's actually really not all that hard, right, at a material level. But the global, I think the white fragility part creates the barrier about, oh my God, we couldn't possibly do this, and I have nothing to do with this, and we couldn't. It would destroy our economy, and well, like Chris, you said, pull myself up by my own bootstraps, and I made this. I'm Jeff Bezos. I did this on my own. It's, no, you built on an economy that was racist and therefore allowed, and sexist, and allowed for treating people as worthless, and you was not worthless. So in fact, it's all based on that. But I think there is that individual psyche level of fear around guilt, you know, and guilt about, oh my God, if I actually admit that even at my household level, I can look around my house and go, well, I didn't have to buy that. My great grandfather made it. Like, right? Inheritance. It's quite physical. You can see it. I didn't have to, you know, I was never in debt because my grandparents all had jobs, right? And all you have to do is see those connections. But I think white folk go right to guilt and, oh my God. And as, wasn't it Audre Lorde's line about guilt is the most unproductive of emotions? It just stops all conversations. Like, well, I can't deal. I got to shut down now. I can't talk about the structural level responsibility, which is, we need to restore some, not restore, to create balance in material ways. And that can be done collectively if we ask our governments to do it, right? And hold ourselves accountable. So, yeah, gonna have to tax folks and redistribute. But there's great fear about that.
Yeah, I think one thing that, you know, came to mind is that, you know, the benefit to people of color of these restitutions, you know, is clear, whether you're talking about on a financial level or a psychological level, to feel that the wrongs committed were addressed in a meaningful way. But sometimes I think of the question, what do white people need to tell amongst themselves to how this benefits them? Like, what is, because, you know, that's kind of, maybe that's a cynical take to look at it, but, you know, we are self-interested to a degree. So in your mind, what do you think would be, like, if you were trying to explain someone the benefits of reparations or restitution in the case of Canada, what would you try to tell them?
Well, the political scientist in me would say unequal societies are always unstable societies. They collapse. They have to collapse, right? You can't maintain equilibrium, and that's what leads to civil war. And the worst circumstance, right, is you're just setting yourself up for collapse eventually. But that's often too abstract. There's this. I'm just playing with this. I don't know what you guys think, but again, my favorite guy, Resma, was talking about, you know, white folks, you need to think about, you're carrying your heritage with you too, something not worked out, some your people were running away from something and then this, set themselves up. Like, you're carrying a kind of psychological burden there too, which is what has created white supremacist culture, right? This uptightness, stemming from Puritan stock, I got to say, when we read the white supremacist culture stuff, I was like, which is essentially Puritan also, right? And capitalist, these characteristics around, being tight and, don't talk about emotions and all of that, always be right, never be wrong. That has shaped white supremacist culture. And when I say white supremacist culture to people here, recently I've tested it out on friends and they go, oh yeah, like the KKK. And it's like, no, just white culture is by definition white supremacist culture. Oh, right, never thought of it that way. So it's right, a really interesting thing to call out, because that's what it does. It creates this standard. And you'd think, being a feminist, I would have seen this more quickly, right? Because we talk about patriarchal culture in the same way, right? It's not that men think they're all that, but that the culture is set up so that it's easier to think you're all that. If you're especially a white straight guy, this is like, it magnifies your sense of self. And it's same for white people in white supremacist culture, right? This magnified sense of self, and your culture is the non-culture, just the neutral background against which all things happen. But it's a pretty problematic culture in itself, right? It needs to be unpacked. It's the culture that's created rapacious capitalism. It's the culture that's created climate change, right? One which sees nature as some sort of thingy that we get to use for our own resources. And a lot of Indigenous folks in Canada have been saying that, like, you guys, you want to address climate change, progressive whites, you want to address climate change, but you refuse to address a culture which is based on rationalistic thoughts, self-other division, all of that. So there is a benefit in both the restitution of creating a more equitable society, but also going through that process of unpacking white supremacist culture within white minds, which I think leads to a more human place to be. But again, just my theory.
Very rich conversation. Thank you for joining us. I want to end with something we sort of danced around, which is the contemplative approach to this very complicated picture. So this is very improv, and I would like to invite, and I'll start, I'd like to invite each of you to lead us in a 1-minute contemplation about this material and about our discussion today. I will start. So if you can just imagine a person or several people you're very close to, your relatives or their children, your godchildren, nieces or nephews, grandchildren. And you can foresee them repeating the same mistakes about racism that we've made in our lives. What would you tell them if you could? We'll just spend a minute contemplating that, and we'll move on to the next person. Thank you. Who would like to go next?
I'll go. I'll go. If you will, picture someone someone that you see, whether in person. This could be what they call a neutral person, someone that you don't have a particular positive, loving or negative or frustrating experience with. Is probably better if that's the case. If this person is white, think of where their ancestry comes from and think of the forces in that nation, the combativeness or the disagreement between governments, the potential nationalism, and then think about the tension that caused in their homeland and the forces that may have led that person's ancestor to come here. And then think about the tension they had being in a new land. And think of what they may have done to people, not because they hated them, but because they were conditioned that way. And so during this minute, think about your own conditioning and your own ancestry, and think about how maybe when you view or think of people of color, that think of your own conditioning and how it may sometimes get the best of you or cause you to have views that conflict with your sense of yourself. So I just like to ask you to think about that for a minute. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Chris. So I was thinking we could try, if you just look at an object that's around you. It could be your computer. It could be anything really. Any object, human-made object that's around you, or food if it's in front of you. And if you just gaze at that object for a while, take note of its characteristics, its shape, its color, its feel. And then you might think about, how did this object come to be where it is? How did it come to you? How has it gotten to you? It's an Amazon delivery guy. It's a store. What store was it? Who's working there? The post. Do you see the cashiers and workers at a store where you might have bought it, boxing it up, putting it on display, explaining it to you. See if you can see their faces or imagine who they might be, what their conditions in life might be. And what gratitude you might have towards them for having gotten this to you. You maybe express that gratitude. And then you can step further back. Who made this object? What factory did it come from? What hands touched it? What minds designed it? What are the parts in it that came from elsewhere? Under what conditions? Who brought this to you? What substances are in it? Where did they come from? And again, imagine under what conditions did that happen? What enabled that? What might be the lives of the hands that brought this to you? And again, we might just think about our appreciation, our gratitude, our luck in being able to have this thing that's come through all these hands. And we might see how we are tied to the people who've brought it to us. And if that brings up some sense of guilt or pain, just touch into that and then let it go. Maybe send our gratitude and our wishes for well-being to those folks whose labor and effort to the planet and its materials that have brought this thing to you. And again, send out our appreciation and a wish that they might be well, they might be healthy, they might be safe and happy. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Please, if you are not a participant and watching this video on YouTube, please don't forget to like and subscribe, because that way you will get notifications if we ever repeat this Courage to Look project. So thank you, Leslie, for joining us today in this conversation, and thank you for your bravery.
Thank you, you guys. This has been fabulous. I love this course, and talking with you has been great.
Yeah, great. Likewise. Yeah.